Okay, we are on air, and this is the Research Methods Fall 2017 Forum 1. We'll be specifically talking about research and design methods specific to discourses in this forum. And we are recording it so that all of you who are attending it today can review it later, or the students who were not able to join with us today can look at it and follow the discussions. I want to cover a few things in terms of our agenda item today. One, I want to lay out some of the important framework items and premise for the class. I hope that that would clarify some of the questions I'm receiving from all of you in email. Second, I would like to briefly introduce the idea of discourse, why we are looking at it. And following that, I would actually turn it over to each of you, where I would give you very briefly to talk about what you are thinking about in terms of case study selection, how you are looking at those projects or a project by a practitioner through the lens of discourse, and how you think that could help you start forming some research questions about your design position or thesis research position about a specific topic of your interest. And then I would like to wrap up with reiterating some of the important aspects of this exercise one, which would be the presentation will be due at the end of the following week, though I want to see a draft at the end of this week. And then if you have any questions, open questions, specific or general. All right. Any question at this point of time, or anything else would you like me to address other than what I outlined? All right. So the research methods course as a prerequisite to the advanced design studio, I know there might be one or two students who have taken studios already and taking the research methods now, but we are phasing out that policy because research methods exists as a prerequisite to whether you're doing thesis or you're doing the advanced design studios. And the reason behind is that for advanced design studio and or thesis, the learning objectives are based on systemic development of a project based on design application, design on applied research, and critical thinking. And when we want to teach students about those three things, or when you as students want to learn that for your academic career and practice, you want it to be based on clear methodological steps in a systemic way that is evidence-based, through which we can formulate questions, we can test them, and then we can apply them. And essentially, these three steps, formulating questions, testing the questions or assumptions, and then applying them to some extent, are the three important steps around which this course is framed. Now, the big disclaimer or big thing to, or important thing for you to remember is that this is not a thesis course. This is not a design studio. So you are not going to exactly do a thesis or do a design project. So the premise of this course is to give you examples, help you test out some things, and give you a taste of what things can be covered through very specific references, and that's where the case studies come in. So that we will use the case study, whatever designer or practice you select, and I'm using the Critical Practice Studio just as a framework example, that would help you guide through this process of formulating questions or connecting to discourses, the first step, testing out these questions or certain positions you take at the end of discourse by selecting certain methods, which is the second, methodology, and third, thinking about application, proposition, context, what kind of outcomes possibly you will be able to generate. So to use the case studies throughout the class, we will use the case study to understand discourses, how in a specific project, an established designer or practitioner is using discourse to take certain large positions, how they are framing these questions, what kind of methods do these firms or designers use in their project to test out their positions, and what kind of outcomes and in what context they produce and practice. And in each step, as you learn from these case study projects, as you analyze them, parallelly, I will ask you to test out what you can do. So let's say I am looking at lateral office as a case study or discourse this week and next week. I will select a project. In some cases, it could be more than a project. And I will try to understand and analyze how lateral office talks about discourses, or what kind of discourses they talk about or they connect to in their project. And using that, based on a topic of my interest, I will try to see if the way lateral office talks about discourses, can I use the same principles or philosophies to talk about discourses in my project based on my topic of interest? Can I use the same discourses, or can I tweak them? Can I make their own and develop kind of a parallel thesis statement or a design statement for myself? So I'm explaining the process I want you to do for these next 2 weeks. When we get to methods, I would want you to do the same thing. Method for the case study, then apply for yourself. Context and outcome from the case study, then apply for yourself. So the methods and the context, we'll get to that soon, but these 2 weeks will be about discourses. Any question as of now? All right. So we will use this kind of case study based or precedent based methodology just as a reference, as a tool, so that we are not just on our own starting with vacuum. I would refer to Paul Krugman's reading that was required for this week. I hope you have started to do the readings. If not, do so during this week as you are drafting, preparing the draft and starting to work on the assignment. And in his reading, he talks about 4 things, right, as a way to frame how he works in his research. He brings from his field of economics, economic model, etc. Anybody wants to mention what are the 4, or at least one of the steps he talks about in his reading, if you have looked into the reading?
He talks about questioning the question. So looking at if someone's questioning something and they've looked into something, question what they're questioning as well.
Yeah, so that's about critical thinking. That if a question comes to your mind, don't just assume it by default. Don't just take or accept the typical answers we know from our background or previous class or education or from our daily experience. It's also, it's not just about our assumptions, it's also about what your professor is telling or what you're reading in a book. Question it, right? And that would help you go deeper. What else?
Listen to the Gentiles.
A little bit louder.
Listen to the Gentiles.
What does that mean?
I thought that one was pretty interesting. It was talking about keeping your mind open and listening to experts in all different fields. That pertains to architecture, because architecture is a convergence of so many different things. So just keeping your eye out for all different types of expert opinions is always a benefit.
So, I mean, there are more than, or I should say, multiple things that we can learn from that idea of listening to the Gentiles. So one, it says that a question that comes to your mind or something you want to work on, mostly it's not the first time somebody's working on that. I mean, architecture or any discipline have been People have been working on it, authors have been writing on it, designers have been trying to address, let's say, a problem for some time. There is a history to any discipline. So that's why we look back at literature, we look at projects, we look at how people have started or tried to address the problems. So literature review, precedent research comes from that. It also helps us to contextualize or situate our position, our knowledge, and hopefully our contribution to a wider body of existing knowledge. It also helps us to, third point is, not feel isolated or just be alone. And what you said, Brendan, that learn from what experts have been talking about. But also keep in mind the first thing you talked about, McKenna, you talked about the questioning the question, that yes, listen to the Gentiles, but question it, right? Not to say questioning means dismissing it, but look at the strengths and limitations, look at the logic, look at different points of view about a single thing, right? If I'm looking at cost-effective ways of reducing waste in digital fabrication, don't just look at one expert, maybe look at 2 or 3 different ways of doing it, because most of the time there is no one single way of doing things, especially in architecture and design. There is no one correct thing. So there we are looking at multiple possibilities, multiple truths. It's not just one single truth, which probably a mathematician or a natural scientist would say there is one way, 2 + 2 is always 4. We are not exactly in that what we call positivist framework of philosophy. I'm digressing a little bit. The few other things he talks about is that to be silly and be daring. So try out new things. So that's kind of a corollary to don't just go with what's already there. Don't be afraid to try out new things. Don't be afraid to ask a question. Don't assume that it's silly. Don't assume that because experts are doing this, I cannot question it. Right? So these principles that he uses are interrelated. And what was the other one? Anybody remembers?
Simplify and simplify.
Right. So simplify, simplify, simplify. And that's very important. And that connects to one thing that is a learning outcome, or a principle that you learn in studios or many classes. Studio is one important aspect. And that's communication, oral communication, written communication, visual communication. And we will be doing this through PowerPoint presentations or slide presentations. That's a combination of visual and written communication. When you present during these forums, it will be about oral presentation. That you have to present the information in a simple way so that it can be understood by different kinds of audience. So when you are talking to your professor, or you're presenting to your boss who is a designer, or your design principals in your office, or an expert like mechanical engineer or a structural expert or ADA expert or whatnot, you can speak kind of in jargons. We can use terms that kind of experts and we as an experts know. But let's say you're going and talking to your clients, who are not from our fields, or when you are going and making a presentation to a city hall, to politicians, or you're applying for a grant or funding from an economic agency, you are going to talk to different groups of people who may not be educated or may not have the exact knowledge that you do as an expert from your field. So it is important to keep it simple, but also learn who is your audience and what is the purpose of your project. And any design project, any research project at any level is a project in communication. You're always trying to communicate certain form of knowledge with respect to old knowledge, and then you are creating new knowledge. So that, keep in mind those 4 things. Read, it's a short article, short paper, but also important thing is that as you are reading, think about how you can make it your own. You don't have to exactly follow it. You can analyze them, interpret them, and use it in your own way for your design project or research project. The other reading, which is the reading about kind of the thesis, Jaziombrek reading, really talks about the idea of a thesis. Anyone wants to define what is a thesis? Whether you're doing a design project, there is design thesis. If you're doing a research project, there's a research thesis. What does thesis mean? Take a step. There is no right or wrong.
Doesn't thesis mean that?
A little louder, please.
Doesn't thesis mean that you're trying to understand a whole range of problems and decide what you can get from that? You're going to investigate what that means and where that can go.
That's partially involved in it. So that what you want to investigate, what is the issue or problem you want to look at? Is there a big problem that you want to solve? Yes, that's part of it, but that's not the core or essence of when we say thesis. It's about what you said is problem solving. We do that a lot through design, but that essentially is not thesis. Though what you said is an important part of it. What can be some other ways or other important factors by which you would define what you call a thesis?
So in literature, you argue for or against something, and you show how it can be argued through different tools that an author used. So in architecture, he says that a thesis has the possibility to work within the obscure domain of identity and difference with structures of other aspects of our personal, cultural, and institutional life, not simply the ones having to do with architecture. So I don't know.
I mean, I think the most important thing that you said is the idea of, you said you argue. So that's
you have to prove your argument.
Thesis is presentation of an argument, right? And in this case, when I am presenting a thesis, my argument. It's not just the arguments that have been presented so far, other experts' argument, that's the context. But in the context of that, let's say the case study you're analyzing or looking at, there are arguments made by lateral office, Interboard, or NAL, or Eldorado, or whoever you're looking at, right? So that's an important thing to identify. But most important thing when it's your thesis, what I'm interested in and what I will be evaluated is what kind of arguments you are presenting and how are you arriving at that argument. And later, how are you testing that argument? And finally, what kind of outcomes or propositions you want to create or come up with to as an application of that argument. So argument is another important thing. Anybody else? Anybody else? Okay, so continuing with that idea of, and I think just as a logistical note, if you're not talking, if you can keep your microphone muted, because sometimes we get echo back, it becomes a feedback loop. Thank you. So continuing with the idea of the argument, thesis also means setting forth, right? Putting forward and taking a very specific position. And it's important because that's what precisely the discourse activity and the discourse exercise wants you to do. And that's what I want you to do at the end of the discourse assignment, that I want a thesis statement from you. And thesis statement should be a very specific position, very specific argument that you will make, you will put forward, okay? And that argument should be based on your response to a question, which we call the research question, or it could be multiple research questions, though at this, for this exercise, for this class, I would want you to stick to maybe one, ideally. If you have more, maybe two related questions. And discourses are important to that aspect because discourses, by discourses, we mean larger talking points, larger points using which we want to talk about our project, right? It's not the project itself. It's not the methods we are using to create a project. So it's not about, I'm going to use digital fabrication and CNC machine, or I'm going to do an urban design survey by naturalistic observation of people's behavior, or I'm going to do series of simulation modeling using CATIA to study how it responds to certain behavior. Or it's not about doing I'm going to go to the library and do an archival study of historic use of, let's say, dining rooms and how dining rooms in houses have evolved over time. So these things I'm describing are methods. Or it's not about El Dorado uses a lot of digital fabrication, or Interboro uses a lot of people's participation, or who was the firm that came this summer? I'm forgetting her name. This firm uses a lot of models and full-scale models to do their project. These are methods, these are tools, these are tactics we are explaining. So this we would address in the second phase. It's also not about they produce a lot of master plans, or they produce a lot of models, they produce a lot of mapping. Those are outcomes. They work in the context of a large-scale master plan with city halls, or they work with schools and colleges with students. That's the context we are talking about. The discourses mean the large scale, larger level, philosophical, often large, big talking points. So for example, Lateral Office, if you look at their projects, they work with the discourse of ecology and ecological thinking. The idea that whether I'm producing an object like a pen or a phone, or I'm creating a house, or doing an interior design, or doing a large-scale urban planning project, they are systematically connected through a larger ecology. And it could be ecology of money and their flow, ecology of materials, ecology of environmental issues, interrelationships of social factors. So even the ecological design or ecological framework, we can think about multiple discourses within it: sociology, politics, material science, climatology, etc., etc. So these are what we call discourses. Or if we think about Interboro, one of the discourses they talk about is people and their participation and how we can learn from that. Or they talk about multiple actors in a city. So who are the users? Who are the actors? So that's a discourse of social inclusion, where design connects to different ways or different philosophies of inclusive thinking and social ethics. So when we are talking about discourses, these are the things I am interested in. So if you are thinking about a project and that is very small scale, and let's say digital fabrication, which is a technique and a tool, is it a discourse of material, that how we can test out and push the boundaries of certain materials using this technology? Is it a discourse of accessibility, that using the digital fabrication we can reduce cost and provide access to high-end design to different groups of people, irrespective of their social background or economic capacity, because architecture, typical traditional orthodox architecture, have been catering mostly to middle income, high income clientele. So is that a discourse or something else? Is it about reduction of waste? Is it about discourse of design itself as how we can do scaling and we can do integrate the designer from a formulation of the design to modeling to prototyping to full-scale design, testing, and ultimately building? So there are different ways of talking about the same project. And if I give you one single project, and that's what we do in studio, right? When we have 12 students, 16 students, 20 students, each of you approach the project in a very different way. And that's where discourses come in. So now I would like to turn it over to each of you. And based on your initial reading, I want you to talk about, very briefly, 5-6 sentences. Talk about what case study you have selected, which designer, which firm, which specific project if you have selected so. And based on what I talked about so far about discourse, what you have learned a little bit from investigating and starting to look at the projects, what kind of initial understanding you have about this firm or this project, one. And second, I also want you to talk about 3-4 sentences about your topic of interest. And again, very introductory. Within that topic of interest, what kind of discourses you think will be important? Okay. And that would help you, this discussion, I'm hoping, would help you start doing the exercise, submit the draft, which are, I think, 6 slides, 8.5 by 11 at the end of this week, and then 12 slides the following week. And I would look at the draft submission and give you some feedback. Okay. So before I open up and let you talk, any question or need clarification about what I said in terms of discourses? All right. So I will ask one by one. I will call you out and please briefly talk about those 2 things specifically. Feel free to raise any question. Unmute yourself when you are talking. Others, please keep mute so that, again, we don't have the sound feedback. Okay. Let's start with maybe Bana, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. You're still mute, Bana. Bana, we cannot hear you. You are muted.
I'm sorry. No, do you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Bana, and my interest area is proportions and golden ratio specifically. I'm trying to search in this area to like, my question is, which I want to find an answer for it, is what make the design is attractive? Is the proportions make the design attractive naturally, or the designer like he wants to make that attractive by calculation or measurements? Like in history, pyramids in Egypt, they depend on the golden ratio, and we don't know if the designers like naturally doing that or it's by calculating and measurement. And my study case is LTL architecture firm. I'm trying to figure out the like their measurements and calculation by the images they provided and by the publications they do. And that's it. I don't know. I'm a little bit lost because this is my first online class, and this is my first semester at LTU.
Okay, that's fine. Hopefully, through these discussions, we will clarify the process, and as you explore and as you learn, I'm sure you will find a more specific path within which right now feels kind of too many things and overwhelming and at a loss. And actually that's a part of any research or design process. And this is oftentimes the most hardest or the most difficult part of a project. And that is problem formulation, not problem solving.
Yeah.
And once we have a problem identified, it becomes very specific, and we can explore a few very specific tools to resolve it. But what questions to ask, which areas to look at, why I should pick a problem, is it relevant, is probably the most difficult stage of any project, whether it's a design project. When in studios, typically you are given a project, but as you advance, the problem formulation, even in those of you who have taken ID5 in LTU, the Integrated Design 5 studio, it's a lot about finding a problem, identifying a problem. Now, having said that, I think example of LTL and your interest in the proportion, I think if we start to think about discourse, but I think there are a few possibilities, and there might be others as you read about them, as you look into LTL. One is obviously the question of aesthetics. You talked about why something is attractive or why certain proportion is attractive. I would want you to go deeper and start thinking about, okay, what do I mean by attractive? Is it simple liking that I feel that is good? Does it vary from people to person? Are there certain universal things that are liked? Another term that we often use is what is preferred? Why certain ratios are more preferred? Why they are pleasing to our eyes? Is it about just preference? Is it about visual perception? Is it about something in our human biological evolution, how we have evolved, that we prefer certain looks and certain ratios? Why golden mean ratio is so popular, or why Egyptians and Greeks and later Romans use that, right? What kind of ratio or proportions were used by somebody like Le Corbusier, who created this whole modular, right, based on human anthropometrics, right? So I want you to think about, so the aesthetics, the visual outcome, the proportion is the thing that we see or we touch and we look at an object, right? When we pick up a phone or a book or the space we are in or a paper we are looking at. But the key thing to ask would be, what are the things underlying behind that results in this ratio, right? So for example, the Greeks came into this very precise ratio of square root of 5 plus 1 whole divided upon 2. Not just they just came up with that number, they found that ratio based on observation of nature, right? In orchids and in leaves and in sea animals like sea anemones and oysters, right? And by measurements and calculations, they came up with that number and they found that ratio. So it is a discourse of observation which goes to a technique of and methodology, but it is about the understanding of learning from nature. And that's a discourse, right? And then we can talk about biomimicry that we see today, learning from nature. I'm not saying you have to do a project in biomimicry. If you look at Corbusier, his underlying principle of coming out with certain ratios and proportions was human body. How much we can reach, how we can sit, how do we sit. And that's not just Corbusier. Anthropometrics is used today in industrial design and product design, right? The laptops we are using, how Apple is using their cell phones, right? Or how cars are made. It's all about human function. How do we function? How in architecture, we don't talk about much. We don't actually teach also, unfortunately. It's all about human body. It's a discourse of very first principles of what we see and how we see. If I'm looking at this space, what is the angle up to which we can see, after which it becomes peripheral vision, right? The very core principle of urban design and ratios of good courtyards or good streets, right? And we say oftentimes that, oh, Paris or Chicago has a great spatial perception because of these ratios, but we don't get into that why. And we just say that, okay, just build 4-story building and make the street this wide. But we don't go behind the fact of, okay, why 1-to-1 ratio between horizontal and vertical dimension is great to create this perception of safety and security. But it's all about the human body. But so the discourse is not about the 1:1 ratio in great streets. The discourse is about how human body and human capacity is driving this design and the ratio.
Yeah.
So now you don't have to exactly look into the discourse as I mentioned, but like that, I want you to find out what are these underlying principles behind it. That's the way you can get to these discourses. And look at what LTL is doing. And then more importantly, I want you to think about what kind of discourses you want to talk about for your interest in ratios and proportions.
Right.
All right?
Yeah.
All right, let's go to Brendan.
Hello.
Go ahead.
So the firm I chose was Nada Architects. They're out of Boston. They were one of the first people on the list that came a while ago. One of the projects that they worked on that I was kind of drawn to as maybe a case study is a arena they did in St. Paul as a competition. It's not actually built, called Thunder Stadium. So it's a soccer stadium that they did, and the thing that kind of caught my attention is that it seemed like most of the focus was on the programmatic elements of it, not just as an arena, but how it ties into like the fabric of a city. So I mean, they were looking at things like airplane flight over the arena, how people flow into the arena off the streets, retail around the arena. So I thought it was kind of interesting that it's almost like they put the stadium itself on the back burner and focused more on how it would tie in with the city. So I thought that was kind of an interesting driver that they chose.
Okay, so quickly, just to respond to that and bring the discourse point of view to that, what you described in terms of what you found important and intriguing in the project is the programming, the context. We will look at it very specifically in terms of what kind of context these designers are putting their project into. So the way you described was more about context, which we'll get into Forum 3. So I want you to focus on the same things, but again, like we were telling Bana, that you need to look at what are the larger talking points and larger philosophies behind their intention, for example, to situate And what you said, turning it on its head, it's not about the stadium, it's actually about the city. So connectivity, is that a discourse? Accessibility, is that a discourse? Right? The philosophy of mixing uses, right? Not just mixed use programming, because that's more about programming as a context, but the philosophy that one space can be used by multiple stakeholders and multiple users, that could be a discourse.
Okay.
Right? I don't know if there was, I don't know specifically and personally about the project. There are a lot of cases, these kind of large stadium projects are all about economic development in the city. So that could become economic and political discourse. Okay, so for the purpose of this assignment, these 2 weeks, more than you describing the project, what it is and how did they do that and what did they come up with, I mean, yes, you will of course look at that, but I want each of you to look at what's underlying it. What's the designer's intention? What's their argument in doing the project in this way? What kind of larger talking points through which they're approaching? How they are marketing or pitching their project. So keep in mind that those are the things we are interested in for these 2 weeks. So highlight those,
Okay.
right? Try to make diagram of these ideas and intentions and the processes and these large scale talking points, which are most of the time not architecture. It's economics, it's humans, biology, it's physiology, it's anthropometrics, it's anthropology, it's sociology, it's politics. So this is the time we are actually being quite divergent. We are looking at other things, large-scale things we can associate our architectural outcomes to. And we are interested in those outside things. Okay, so that's an important distinctive aspect of this assignment on discourse. Anything else, Brandon, you want to add?
No, it's good. That's
okay.
good.
Let's go to Candace.
So I'm interested in the concept of space, and I'm actually in ID5 right now. So we've been talking. Space? Yes.
Okay.
So space as in like public parks and different areas where people can connect with each other, and different alleyways that are in a small close-knit area where people can share the space and they can interact in a close environment. So with that, my last case study from module 2, I was looking at LTL architects, and I thought they had a few interesting projects. And the one that I ended up choosing was Build a Better Blurb. I don't want to study that anymore, but I think based off of their projects, I can find another case study that they might have done that would deal with the concept of space and trying to connect people together in different areas.
Okay. Okay, I think it would be important how you define your interest in what you started by saying faith, and how do you unpack that?
I didn't say faith. I said space.
Space.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. So I think when you started with space, that's quite generic and vague. And as you started unpacking in terms of social connection, interaction, kind of you use certain terms like close-knit. So I think what you're interested in, as I hear you talking, is about physical configuration of space and how it connects to the opportunities of interaction. So again, I mean, there could be many different ways to approach that, and I think looking at a very specific project of a case study would help you get some ideas, and then think about, if you want to develop a design project or a thesis project or research project, in what way you want to approach space or a design of a space that could inculcate these opportunities of interaction. So for example, William White and his famous work in Social Life of Small Urban Spaces looked at spaces, very specific types of space. And he focused on small plazas, small courtyards, small open spaces at the base of skyscrapers in New York City. And he was interested in why some of them work and why some don't. And the specific things he was interested in was, or how he measured success, was its human use and the human behavior in it, interaction in, and success as a public space. So that's a discourse of publicness. That's a discourse of interaction opportunities. That's a discourse of how people interact, what kind of activities happen. And connected to that discourse of publicness, he used very specific methods of naturalistic observation. He observed people's behavior. He observed what's there in the setting and how people are interacting with it, right? So I can look at, I mean, there are other examples of public spaces or projects with public spaces where the discourse could be more social and anthropological. For example, a researcher named Setha Lowe, Lowe, has looked into public spaces in Costa Rica, for example, through purely who are using it, so William White's behavior, but she is more interested in gender and demographics. So that's a more sociological and political discourse in the same ideas of public space, right? So related, but two different approaches and two different discourses about public space, right? So as you think about space, whether you're thinking in terms of alleyways and street, one way to come up with a discourse or connect to one or two discourses would be to specify the types of space you're interested in. Is it a morphological discourse, for example? Plaza, parks, alleyways, streets. Is it a social discourse of how different groups of people? Is it more about looking at environmental psychology and people's behavior? That's a different discourse. And there could be others. So that's something you can look at it, and LTL or other projects by other designers. And that's something you should focus on, that how or what kind of ways they're approaching this project on space and interaction. Okay,
so can I take it from like maybe what I want to focus on? So as an example, you talked about plazas. If I wanted to focus on plazas, then I can find a case study that more relates to that.
Yes, sure. I mean, that's a good point. So what you're talking about is, I mean, you're asking that how do I select a case study? And all of you have been grappling through it. So again, I mean, we are testing out things, and I'm not going to hold you to that, okay, this is the research project you have to carry out beyond ID5, or this is what you need to do. No. And you may test out something, and later in ADS or in cases, you may do something else. So we are learning the process. So yes, so there are two ways to do it. One, I'm interested in Plaza. So as I'm looking through critical practice studio examples and practitioners, I may be searching specifically through, okay, is there a project about Plaza? And that's a way to select the case study, yes. But that doesn't have to be always the case. Sometimes a project might be very interesting to you, And it might be about a street, or it might be about even an interior space, right? But you may find that the way this designer is connecting or talking about human behavior or sociology or material, it might be the discourse that attracts you. And then you may think about, okay, if I take that discourse, I decontextualize the discourse from the project, can I apply that discourse about a coffee shop interior into a plaza? Right? And that is actually done in a lot of projects. Like LTL is famous for that. I mean, a lot of interior restaurants, for example, they have done restaurants projects using the discourse of a street. Or look at Rem Koolhaas or OMA, not a critical practice studio practitioner. But when he talks about Seattle Public Library and the gathering spaces and interaction spaces, he almost talks about those spaces as plazas, right? So it's an exterior typology brought into an interior typology. Again, so the discourse of interaction is the same, and the publicness is the same, but it's decontextualized. At this point, I'm interested in discourse. I don't care how you select it. It's fine if you select a project on Plaza and analyze it and use it in your project. That's fine. In the same way, you can select a project that's not a Plaza and you learn from that discourse and apply it in your project. And the application could be copy paste and test out. The application could be you can take the discourse and tweak it. You can create your own interpretation. You can critically question it and respond to that. Any and everything is fine.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we did Bana, we did Brendan, right? Okay, let's go to Fajr. Are you there, Fajr? Okay, we can't hear you, so let's try, we'll come back to you. Let's go to Leah. Leah, can you hear me? Can you guys hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, I can hear.
Yeah, I do too.
Okay. Leah, if you can hear me, you can start.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
I can hear you.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sorry.
That's all right.
So my research topic is based on programming, and I chose LTL architects as my case study. They are very client-based in their research, so I think that's a good case study for my topic. Through that, I guess, is the communication that they have with their clients, as well as presenting that information. I think that's very important.
Okay, so a few things. I think programming as a topic is good, and I mean it's an integral part of any architectural design project. Some of the things you mentioned in terms of LTL, and a lot of their projects have interesting programming and how they approach it. But some of the things you mentioned are more focused on the tactics they're using and how they use programming as a context of the project. like how they communicate with client. I want you to, at this stage, and we'll get there, but at this stage, I want you to think a little bit broadly in terms of what larger things that we don't see right away influence the idea of programming, or why programming is important for a project. And you can analyze that through LTL and then use it for your own. So for example, clients, which you mentioned, is an underlying factor for programming. So that's a discourse of importance of users, right? A lot of times programming is also a result of building codes and regulations, right? So that's another discourse through which we can understand programming. A lot of times programming, which is connected to the building regulation, they are in place because of needs of public health, right? Certain programming we analyze in terms of their proximity. We do bubble diagrams, what is compatible and what is not compatible, or what is completely incompatible, is based on how certain function need certain qualities in the environment. And there can be contradictions or reinforcement. So when there is reinforcement, we want to put them together. When it's contradiction, we want to keep them apart. Programming can also go beyond just the notion of typical baseline functionality to more reasoning from aesthetics to public health, which I already mentioned, to more kind of advanced and nuanced philosophical idea about interaction, connection, certain kind of networking, or what kind of experience we want to give the people who are using it. Related to the users, programming need not be always about the users, but it could be also about how we express the programs in form, could be about people who are looking at the buildings from outside, so who may not be direct pure clients, but indirect clients, right? And it may vary from whether I'm designing a building, whether it's a residence or a institution, so the users and the client is very different, to an urban scale project I'm doing in a neighborhood where the stakeholders are multiple, and there are direct and indirect consequences of my programming decisions. So at this point, I want you to focus on these underlying principles behind and underlying factors behind programming. Users, clients, focus on public health or codes or others, right? And there you may find there are other ways that programming can be approached.
Okay.
All right, good. Let's go to Lynn.
Hello.
Yes, go ahead.
All right. So my topic, I guess, area of interest is sustainability in conjunction with, I guess, high security government typology buildings. I think the overall discourse, or what I think maybe a discourse for this topic would be wellness and what it is to be well, and potentially looking at sustainability as a tool to achieve this. But when confronted with this specific typology that involves high security, we see, or I see, a bit of a friction, I guess, between sustainability and the inherent requirements of security, and I guess how can we achieve wellness within that framework? And that's, I guess, sort of where I am right now in developing research will become and entail.
Okay, and is there any specific case study you were looking at?
The case, I was looking at Interborough Partners. Their work I quite enjoy, although I feel doesn't necessarily relate to where I'm going in my own research, but I enjoy learning from them and their methodology, their approach to get out in the community and go sort of, I guess, above and beyond the conventional approaches taken to community involvement to get this more unheard voices, their remarks on the disproportionate, I guess, impression you receive from community meetings and those people who have, say, the time and the ability to go to those meetings versus someone who, you know, well, they would go to the bus stop or leave cards in local businesses, and those types of strategies are very intriguing, and I think provides you with more accurate data on what that community requires or would prefer to see given a certain topic. How it comes back to what I'm looking at, there may be a disconnect, and I'm not sure, I guess, what to do with that at this point, because I enjoy learning about their work, but I guess don't really see how it fits in with what I'm interested in looking at right now.
Okay. Yeah, I think, I mean, at this point, and I think it's an intriguing topic, quite conflicting, as you point out, between certain qualities of wellness or well-being, human well-being, and the demands of close accessibility, networked materials, or kind of that is attached to locality in a lot of sustainability metrics. And on the other hand, especially in the typology of high security, if we are looking at governmental buildings, for example, the need for segregation to some extent, or separation to some extent, for safety and security and protection and so forth. So I think you're highlighting and hinting at some of these large-scale discourses which are very relevant today, especially in the post 9/11, September 11 time period, where we are seeing in designs of public spaces or public buildings like city halls, airports, museums, stadiums, and many others, that these are conflicting values, right? So there are these discourses of safety and security, and to large extent a discourse of fear, right, which has become a reality and relevant that needs to be considered. On the other hand, there are these discourses of public values, of interaction, connection, openness. In case of interior buildings, it's slightly different, where a lot of times we want to be physically separate or visually not permeable, but at the same time, we want to provide natural ventilation, natural daylight, so on and so forth, for wellness or efficient functioning and health of the users in that environment. So I think there are a lot of rich discourses involved in it. The key point for you to remember would be there might be many discourses involved in it, and you can identify them, but quickly highlight some of the things that you think are important. Okay, and in your case, I mean, if you're really interested in interborough and you don't think that directly in terms of how they are applying certain techniques directly relate to what you want to do, that's fine. But I think that if you think in terms of discourses, in terms of public discourse of interaction, openness, and kind of value of togetherness versus a discourse of exclusion, separation for the need of safety and security, you will find that in many of their projects. So if you look at their project, I don't remember the name, but it's on exclusionary zoning. And they have some, the outcomes is kind of they have created a graphic novel or kind of a manifesto and posters. But the discourses they're talking about are exactly that conflict between that need of a lot of zoning. We create that separate land use or exclusionary zoning based on this idea of fear of contamination from poisonous gases, or we say that, no, I don't want poor people in this community because they would bring crime, whether that's a fact or not. Those are the perceptions. On the other hand, there are these ideals of togetherness and publicness, right, and interaction. which are quite conflicting. So I think you can learn from how they are negotiating and how they're approaching these discourses. And also, I mean, don't be afraid to take a position, right, and make an argument. And that doesn't have to be always what Interboro is saying. You can critique them and take a position that's opposite to them. That's fine. And it's about taking a position, stating it clearly, identifying why you are taking that, and then test it, right? And this also, I'm jumping a little ahead, is also about any research or design is about when we test our assumptions, right? Initial assumptions, sometimes we call a hypothesis, sometimes we call it education guess, sometimes we call it position and argument. I mean, it shouldn't be just because I believe this, that's why it should be based on a case study analysis or a literature review or some evidence. Testing is important because it can reinforce that, and even more importantly, it can say that our assumption or our position was incorrect or it needs to be modified. And that's equally valid research. Just because we found that what we thought or what we argued is wrong doesn't mean that I have a bad research. And as long as we accept it and go back and modify and learn from it and generate a conclusion, that's a valid, relevant knowledge that we are contributing back to the discipline. Okay, so that's a point I wanted to make. Anything else, Lynn?
That's everything. Thank you.
Okay. Let's go to Lauren.
So the practitioner can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so the practitioner I was looking at was Work AC. And what I noticed over all of at least their urban projects, was that they focus on social discourse and environmental, meaning that, for example, one of their projects looked at the lack of grocery stores in a city and the impact it had on the health of the people around it. Another one was looking at schools, and specifically the pedagogy of how the buildings can inform the students. So the project I specifically chose for the case study was called Nature City, and it started to look at the foreclosure crisis and urban sprawl. But basically their question came down to, what if we could live sustainably and close to nature? And that was how they presented their project, was a type of city that had diverse housing. Your house was your power plant, public space provided clean air, and they looked at density as well. So I like this project because it relates to what I'm interested in, which is more of the sustainable side to urban models as far as housing goes. So they didn't really look at how this could be, how like economics could be interjected in it. It was specifically housing, but I was interested in this model being applied to existing cities, if there's anything I could take away. But as I was looking at this, so it's always been something I'm interested in. As I was looking at this, what also interested me was this idea of the American dream that kind of got them into the urban sprawl and foreclosure crisis anyways. And why would people who that's kind of their platform, that's what they want, why would they actually even move to this new city that they presented? Because there is like an intimate relationship with having like a single owned house, and everything they presented in this project was multifamily housing, although it was diverse typologies to kind of attract each type of person. So I guess there's two ways I'm looking at going about this for my research, which is a model in looking at how their model could be applied to cities already existing, or looking at something that I haven't really figured out yet, which is why do we live the way we live as far as the American dream goes, and how do you change those thoughts and make it to something where it can be denser and more environmentally impactful in an urban city?
Okay. Yeah, I think there are a lot of discourses involved in, I mean, the idea of, and you're interested in housing, city, and the idea of the American dream. I think you are unpacking it well, so continue to do that. And I think the key would be for this assignment, two things. One is how you can visualize these complex layers and which elements in that layer become important. So two things I found interesting was the diversity when you're talking about housing and cities, diversity and economics. And so how you define diversity of people, diversity of housing types, and that could translate to very specific diversity of built form. It could be diversity of programming, all these things, but again, coming from the diversity of discourse. And how these elements of diversity then connects to economics. And I mean, there are a lot of studies, and you can build on that, that does, for example, diversity of different groups or different types of housing lead to better economics, right? And oftentimes it is. I mean, there's a lot of argument about that we need to zone instead of exclusionary single-use zoning, right? A lot of criticism about, you mentioned urban sprawl, and Workace's project reflects on that. That urban sprawl and the suburbs, typical suburbs we see around us with this, how they're zoned with, especially residentially, with single-family zone houses in large plots, economically exclude out large sections of the population. Because, for example, if we allow multiple family housing, then the same cost that goes in one plot, which can be only addressed by only one family, if multiple family housing is allowed, that cost now can be easily shared by 4, 8, 16 families. So immediately it can cater to lower and lower income people. So that's just an example. But I think there could be a connection between this economic discourse and diversity discourse. And it's interesting because a lot of times they are pit against each other. That's something that is economically viable is not socially viable. And so I think that could be an important area to study. And there have been some works on it, but there could be some good way to critically reflect on it and contribute to that.
Okay, thank you.
The second part I wanted to say is that don't focus too much on LTL's outcome for this assignment and what you are going to do, but more think about how they're approaching, what kind of large-scale discourses they're reflecting on, and how you can use some of them or maybe critically look at them.
Okay.
So the ultimate outcome that you may come to, we'll get to that later.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Go to McKenna.
I think I got it to work.
Okay, let's.
I mean, I don't want to take some.
Go ahead. You're muted, Fajr. You're muted. We can't hear you.
So the case study that I had was NAO, which was a normal architecture office.
It was starting. I had a stroke.
Hello?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I heard something in the background. Yeah, the one project that really interests me that they did was a handball stadium. And at first I thought it was simple enough. But one thing I know about the office is that they are very interested in something they call balkanization, which is bringing back the social culture that was in the Balkan countries in the Soviet times back into the present culture of those countries. And how they're doing that with the stadium is that they want the youth that used to be more athletic and sport oriented to go back to that, since now they're more politically oriented. And that kind of opened up two paths for me, 2 points of interest. Discourses, one is economical, political, where I'm looking at stadiums as a way to open up more opportunities, and mainly looking at how stadiums can serve the society better. Because one thing that I noticed specifically with the Olympics and the World Cup is the stadiums a lot of the times are built for a single event, for a single location, then they're just left to rot and nothing to do, and they are wasted in whatever location they are put. So I'm interested in looking at how we could use that idea of a stadium and multi-purpose facility to open up more doors besides the athletic framework.
Okay. Yeah, I think great topic, great project by NAO. And I think there are a lot of discourses involved in it, from the discourse of war. I mean, that is part and parcel of the idea of balkanization and what happened in Eastern Europe, breaking apart of Yugoslavia. And a lot of architects are working in that. And actually, we have a lot of practitioners here from that area who are studying that. But I think, yes, I think the major discourses are social, political. And I think the key would be how you connect those larger discourses to discourses of multi-purpose, multi-use programming and things like that. And it's not just about spatial programming, it's also temporal. That
exactly.
These can be used by different groups of people at different periods of time.
Exactly.
And it doesn't have to be stadiums. I mean, stadium is a good example. I'm fine if you.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, I said stadium because it's
centers. It could be any large-scale projects, like auditoriums, large-scale performance theaters. That is often used as economic development engines, but they are typically large, big blocks, single-use, and there's been a lot of debate and discussions about places like Comerica Park, Ford Fields in Detroit, or even the new hockey stadium, the Little Caesars Arena. And is it only one? Does it create a neighborhood? Can it produce a mixed-use, multi-purpose center? The key one thing I want to mention, though, make sure that for this exercise, focus on the discourses, the larger talking points. Secondly, as you are starting to look at the stadiums and the idea of multi-purposeness, that itself can be a discourse, the discourse of multi-purposeness and multiple use. Okay, don't focus too much on the outcomes at this point of time. More talk about the approaches, try to analyze, visualize, diagram the approaches and the larger philosophies behind this project. All right, we don't have a lot of time, so I'm kind of moving along a little bit faster.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to McKenna.
Hi, I'm interested in how people interact with each other and with the space because of the built environment. One thing I'm interested in is temporary spaces specifically. So I looked into in a borough, the Lent space projects that they worked in, and how it's a privately owned space, but they gave it back to the public, and how now what used to be vacant is now a public space. And I know that there's been other places that they've looked or that have used them, specifically like pop-up parking spaces where people have a parking space and they do whatever they want with it, and how the public is able to interact with a space that was possibly vacant or not actually supposed to be their use.
Okay. Yeah, I think, I mean, it's a very relevant case study for your topic of interest, the Lent Space Project. Again, I would focus on analyzing and identifying very specific discourses or these larger approaches and kind of talking points, if you will, to unpack the idea of interaction and temporary space, right? And in architecture, the idea of temporary space and the focus on that is quite, I shouldn't say quite, but relatively recent, because typically, traditionally, historic architecture is based on permanence. And that itself is a discourse that how and why we are thinking about temporary and kind of the idea of time. And there are different discourses involved in it. One is the discourse about ownership versus occupation. So ownership is a more long-term thing, right? Versus occupation is more about temporary. And so that could be one kind of discourse you can talk about. There's another kind of discourse that's about control. So who controls the space? One type of control is through ownership, right? If I own, I mean, it's in my control. I mean, a lot of North American spaces are directly driven and controlled through ownership, government control, private control. In many cultures, the control is actually not through ownership, but more about use, right? So if a plaza or a sidewalk, in many cultures, if a vendor sits there every day, or a group of kids who come there and play there every day, it's kind of controlled by them. A lot of times it's socially controlled, and that might be different from gender to gender or age by age. Sometimes it's controlled kind of socio-politically. For example, think about a space controlled by a gang, right? So there are different ways to approach the whole idea about temporary space, control, ownership. And these are the factors I want you to think about and think critically about and creatively about as you look at these projects. And I think land space is a great example where you do have an ownership, you have the city who is interested in, there are users who use that space and go through every day, there are viewers, there are these. So Interboro uses the term actors, urban actors for any project, and they identify them. But behind each actor, there are certain discourse of use, discourse of ownership, discourse of control, discourse of socio-political power. So power could be another way of looking at it, that who has the power actually in a space and how it is manifested. That could be a talking point to discourse. So these are the things I want you to think about and highlight and diagram them in a project. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to Molly.
Okay, so I actually was kind of in the same line with her. I did Interboro's Lent Space project as my case study, but I looked at it in a little bit different of a way. I liked the accessibility to the public, moving and rearranging the space to be different configurations. So you have multi-use in this space. It's not just made for one thing. You can change it into several different ways, as well as using the giving back to the environment. They were using it, planters there, as well as a space for people to go. So they use the planters to grow trees and then use those trees and put it back out into the cityscape to make it more urbanized within the city. So that interests me because I'm also interested into the urbanization and using, getting people more connected with that idea. I don't think the public is totally used to that idea of what it can be used for and the simplicity that things that you can do with it. So I thought this was a great opportunity to look at a case study that would go along with that whole concept of using one thing for multiple uses and then also giving back to the community in a way that they would never see as something original in their eyes.
Yeah, so I think accessibility is an important critical topic of discourse.
Okay.
At the same time, I would not focus more on the outcomes about giving back or creating something original that the community has not thought about. Those are important, but try to think about again, the underlying factors behind those outcomes. So is it accessibility, a discourse of, you talked about access to nature, the plants. Is it about giving back to the community in the sense of well-being and health, right? Is it an environmental discourse in that way, right? Addressing pollution and those things. Is it a discourse of interaction and creating a social space? Is it a discourse of within that social context? Is it a discourse as they used for multiple users? They also had those planters and walls that created also private kind of pockets. So is it a discourse of thinking about privacy within a public space? That itself is a discourse, right? So think about these things at this time, and we'll get to the outcomes and what they did, how they reacted with the community, how are they contributing to. But at this time, very specifically focus on these underlying factors that would help you understand this, sometimes environmental, sometimes social, sometimes political and economic. Sometimes it's about human connection, sometimes it's basic needs and human physiology. And I want to know how you identify with and then prioritize some of these broad, larger talking points or approaches to a project.
Okay.
All right, good. Let's go to Nicholas.
So I've also been looking at Interboro as well. I'm interested in their environmental projects, however, more specifically their projects Living with the Bay and Grassroots Regionalism. In these two projects, they focus on mainly the impacts of environmental catastrophes like hurricanes and storm surge and stuff like that, and how they can revitalize communities after these natural disasters occur. Along with revitalizing these communities is providing places for low-income families to stay, which is also something that I have a strong interest in. It seems that Interboro has tried a couple things with these projects, mainly along, like, obviously their focus is like along coastal cities, so like New York after it got hit by Hurricane Sandy, and then I think a good current event would be like Houston right now, where the stormwater flood or the stormwater surge is extremely impacting people's homes right there. So I think that's something that I would like to focus on, and how they could prevent such catastrophes from happening in the future.
Okay. Yeah, again, I mean, relevant topic with Hurricane Harvey and Irma and Katrina, what we have seen, Hurricane Sandy. And again, I think low-income housing, again, important factor to look at. Focus on what kind of discourses you can talk with. So is it a discourse of climate change, through which we are seeing more extreme events, this kind of rain events, flooding events that Houston is getting in a week, 50 inch, in some cases 60 inches of rainfall in a few days? Is it a discourse of how we produce and consume space, and the belief that through technology we can solve everything? We are building in and living on floodplains. So we know that in the bayous and the levees, and the belief that these engineered solutions can protect us from any kind of event, that's a discourse itself, right? That power of technology and belief in that. And we have seen that that's why Houston has this extensive network of bayous that they built after 1930s. But because they don't have any zoning and very loose zoning laws, people build right next to the canals and the bayous. And essentially they're in the floodplains. And because the natural vegetation, the mangroves that happen in New Orleans, that has happened in Houston and many other communities, we have destroyed them as we have built up. That has reduced the capacity of the urban fabric or the area to be less resilient. So earlier water used to go up, but because there was a lot of permeable surfaces, they had time to go down. In case of extreme rainfall, it won't happen. Still, it will flood, but moderate events, the water will go down much faster. But with more development, indiscriminate development, more concretes, there is fast runoff. So there is this discourse of kind of our assumption that we can create a perfect barrier to protect and keep any element away, whether it's worms and bugs, whether it's water, whether it's by putting a wall or creating a levee or creating a completely controlled environment inside a building. We can keep air out, water out, bugs out, right? And again, we are seeing in these kind of disasters that assumption, that model has failed. And with the low-income housing, I mean, there is a social discourse to that, is that oftentimes we see that most of the disaster-prone areas, buildings or housing built in these floodplains are of people or houses of poor people, because they have the last access to the area. If you look at New Orleans, the historic French settlement was actually in the best part of the topography, and it never flooded because it's not in the floodplains. And a lot of the flood that happened in the lower Ninth Ward are the poorest communities, because they had the last access to spaces, and there's this social argument about that. So think about these and highlight those, and start to think about the connections, the responsible factors behind these discourses, and capture that diagrammatically as you work on the draft. Okay.
Great, thank you.
All right, let's go to Stacy. We're not hearing you. You look like unmuted, but maybe increase the volume. Okay, we'll come back. We'll go to Yashwant and then come back to Stacy.
Hi, can you hear me, sir?
Yes, go ahead.
I chose El Dorado, and the interesting project that I like in them is the Echo Ridge Community Center, which is built in Topeka in Kansas. And the thing what I like about that is they have featured a planter roof. The panels and they have some panels, and they rain barrels that collect water from the transplants. And they also have a very different way of working strategy and with the clients. So that's what they making them be strong with their clients. And besides, I wanted to ask a question about, what would be the best strategy to be a successful framework? Is with the help of a good design groundwork. It's going to be a purpose or a productivity. What would support the design framework in the best way? So yeah, I wanted to ask this for myself, for my case study, and make come through a lot of questions with this and the answer, so that I can help myself with my case study.
Yes, what I was trying to respond to, saying that keep the focus on the discourses. I think as you explained the El Dorado project, I think it's a great project, and what you have identified, and with your interest in the design framework and productivity and purpose, I mean, their process and what they do is important. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I would ask you for this initial assignment to really focus on what kind of discourses El Dorado focuses on, or we can identify them focusing on. They may not say that we are focusing on these things. Mm-hmm. So yes, they make these panels that collect rainwater. The question is, so what? So are they interested in conservation of natural elements like water? Is it an environmental discourse? It's an
discourse. They wanted to make all of their projects a good green buildings, which can be sustainable and as well as reusable, everything. And also they wanted to make sure the design is universal.
Yes. So again, what does universal mean? I mean, I think there are discourses within that. Is it a social discourse of different sections of the society can have access to that building or resource, or what happens there? That's a social way of looking at universal design. Is it universal in the sense of it caters to needs of different age groups, gender? I mean, there are different ways of, or is it more about access, universal access in terms of disability? And I'm not looking for an answer from you right away. It's a more rhetorical question, and you need to think about that. Or is it a more discourse of universal access in terms of community participation, connection between designer and the community, how they define community? That could be a discourse on its own. Is it a discourse of materiality, how they use materials and how they create certain envelopes or components of buildings that have multiple purposes, that it's a screen, but it also collects water? I mean, that's a discourse in itself, that wall does not have to be just a wall. It can do different things. So I want you to highlight on those things right now. It's not about right now much about they have an interesting process and they engage with the community in this way. That's more about the second forum and the second exercise on methodology. I want you to highlight that they're engaging with the community because I think they believe in this aspect of interaction, or this aspect of participation, or this aspect of urban philosophy or design, or this aspect of material philosophy of using certain material. Why they're interested in this philosophy of reuse? Is it cost? Is it material waste reduction? Is it locally available materials? Is it all of them? And then most importantly, okay, these are all different ways of looking at a project and discourses. But for your question, for your topic about productivity and purpose in a design framework, as you start to develop a thesis, I would like to know what Yashwant thinks is important. So starting point is not just asking a question. I want an answer from you right now. And when I say right now, it means at the end of this assignment. And that becomes a position. So you don't just put an open-ended question that how a design framework can utilize productivity or purpose. You tell us how it can be done, or which is important, or what aspect of productivity or what aspect of purpose is important, you think, and why. And in the next stage, we will test it using certain methods. And in the third stage, we will see how we can create a context and purpose and outcomes around that. That would be the process. But for the first assignment, I want you to understand Eldorado and this project through discourses and identify possible discourses for your question, and then take a very specific position through answering it. And this is not for you, all of you. So position is a response, an argument to your research question. Don't just pose a question, answer it. Okay. Thank you, Yashwant. If you have more questions, feel free to email me. Let's go back to Stacy and see if we can work it out. No, we can't hear you. Maybe log off and log back in. Sometimes that helps. And in that meantime, we'll go to Lena.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. My choice was like for like work AC. The case study I'm debating between two, either the one under the urban, it's a smart school, or like or the edible schoolyard, because my subject, I'm interested in sustainability, how we can like multiple use, like the things like for the school lunches and everything, like we can grow that and reuse it and teach the kids how like they can do it in their homes. So that's mainly I'm debating between two, the urban, under the urban design projects, or under the architect. So I'm not sure yet. I didn't put all my plans, but like mainly I want it under the sustainability part.
Yeah, I think the key would be to really focus on sustainability and how you want to talk about sustainability in terms of discourses. And you mentioned some of them. So sustainability as a local resilience, right?
Yeah.
Using local materials, reusing it, that
Yeah.
gives them capacity of using their resources, being efficient, and in case of a disaster or something happens, they can bounce back quickly. That's one kind of discourse. You talked about education, and that's another discourse to think about sustainability, which we don't think much. Sustainability as a part of daily life and how we can learn from it. And I think the school and the edible landscapes can come within that. So again, like I'm repeating myself, I'm telling everybody this at this point of time, really focus on, for example, how they're approaching design or certain thinking approaches, for example, sustainability, how they're approaching, and then with respect to that, how you want to approach in your project. So when you make a thesis statement, I would like to know clearly that for you, sustainability, maybe for a very specific scale, this aspect becomes the most important thing, and that should be very specific, very relevant, and based on application, analysis, and critique of the sustainability approach of your case study. All right?
Yes. Okay.
All right.
And more like, is that connected to like reduce usage for like elements, and makes like is that the part I can connect to the one of these, or this is like a different approach, like I need to study something else about it? Like,
I think you can identify multiple approaches. I think that's part of the process.
Okay.
But then within that, I would want each of you to highlight and prioritize one or two approaches, not more than two. And then say that, okay, based on these two approaches or two discourses, in your case, I believe that for this specific case, whether it's a community or a school, however, whatever skill you're working in, sustainability can be taught in this way. And for a sustainable living, this becomes important. So for example, if I say that for a sustainable idea of living, food is one way to think about sustainability, right? And that could be through access to food, healthy food, and how we learn about how we grow food in our community, take that food and cook, consume, and then how we process the wastes of our food. Again, I'm giving an example. You don't have to do exactly that, but you need to take a very specific position of how you're approaching sustainability in that particular scale.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Stacy, let's see if the third time it works. No, sorry. I don't know, and sometimes it's just we can't figure out. So we have to move on because of time. If you can email me some of your thoughts based on those two topics, case study, what project you're looking at, what discourses you think they are looking at, one, and two, your topic of interest and what discourses you are identifying, and I will respond to that. Sorry about that. Okay. All right, we are above time, so I would be quick. I just want to highlight some of the things of the assignment. So as you go through the assignment, which is in Blackboard, I have given you very specific steps to go through in terms of readings. Do the reading. As you're doing the reading, identify important ways of thinking about large-scale topics outside architecture and connecting to architecture. Second part is looking at your case study. Typically one project. In some cases, you may look at an office who have very consistent ways of approaching discourse. You may look at multiple projects, but one project is fine. And as we have discussed through your presentations and my feedback to that, try to identify these very specific ways these designers are approaching the project. Not what they are doing or how they are doing, but what kind of larger domains, larger disciplines, larger talking points they're talking about. Now, the important thing is that you will not find all the time a website, their website, WorkAC, Eldorado, Interboro, or a book about them, or a Wikipedia that will give you that answer, where they're saying, I am talking about social aspects of security and publicness, or I'm talking about economics and housing. That's you. If you are looking for a ready-made answer to it, you will be disappointed. And that's why it's an exercise. Sometimes you may find the information directly. Sometimes you may find it indirectly from a quote. Sometimes you may find it by researching about the project and the newspaper article on it. So there is some research involved in it. So just Interboro and doing the project and Googling it may not give you the answer. You may have to go deeper. You may go into library database search. You may go into news articles about that project and see what they're talking about. What are the criticism of that project? What kind of discourses people are fighting about, and what are the debates? Sometimes you have to go beyond that, and you may have to use your interpretation, and that's where your analysis comes in. That you think this is the discourse used by lateral office or NAO, not them, and that's okay. Okay? And then the third phase is that can you then highlight some of these important discourses? You may find 10 discourses and highlight 1 or 2, and then use them to develop your own discourse for your project. And then ultimately, using those discourses, develop a thesis statement. Okay? The thesis statement should be confined to 1 page or 1 slide. It should not be a big paragraph, 300 words. It doesn't have to be always just 1 small sentence. You can elaborate on it. It needs to be visualized. It needs to be supported by 3 key citations. And that needs to be kind of strong evidence-based citations. It could be a journal article, it could be a website, it could be a book, it could be, it could not be just a citation to a project and a website reference of the firm. So the citations should be, it does not have to be an academic journal all the time. It could be a newspaper article about it. It could be a quote used by the designer. It could be something from a website where there's a debate about that project. But it should be something external to just the project. Okay, and the thesis statement ultimately should be about you, not the case study, you and your project and your argument. The citations are your tool to use the case studies and things about it. But ultimately, the thesis statement should be about you. I am going to post some examples of visualization of these discourses and diagramming from other practitioners. There is an example right there in the handout or the assignment where you start to see kind of diagrams of different processes involved in contamination, accessibility, and storage. Those are the discourses where, in this case, they have used a lot of icons, but also it needs to be labeled, it needs to be connected. So use text, use icons, use images, use arrows. So visualization of what you're finding, both for the case study and then ultimately for your project, would be an important part. So for the draft, I am looking for if you look at the discussion, the assignment, I'm looking for, at the end of this week, 6 PDFs. I mean, you can do it as a PowerPoint slide and then convert to PDF. 3 for your case study analysis, and then 3 for your own discourse. Okay, and it could be a statement and an unpacking of it, or it could be different discourses you think are important, you highlight. So one slide could be about all the possible discourses. Second slide could be you highlight some of them and unpack it, organize it, connect it. And then the third could be about your thesis statement. It's up to you how you want to organize it. One set of 3 for case study, one set of 3 for your. And then I would respond to that as you submit in Blackboard. And then based on the feedback, my feedback, and also you should use the discussion board during this week to provide feedback to at least 2 other peers. Okay, so you will be also kind of critiques of one another. So you need to submit the draft 2 places, 1 in the assignment and 2 in the current week's discussion board forum, where you will be able to see each other's work. And the discussion board should be a continuous engagement of giving quick feedback, asking questions, and you should respond to 2 of your classmates. I mean, if you come and see that a lot of people have responded to somebody, pick somebody else's, so that everybody has fair amount of feedback. So that's one set of peer reviews, and then you will have my review and quick feedback. Hopefully so if you submitted, let's say latest by Sunday, I would try to get you feedback in the next 2, maximum 3 days. But also you should continue to develop that, and ultimately following week, at the end of the following week, you will submit 12 slides, I think, 6 for your case study and 6 for your own project. Okay, any question?
One quick question. You said you are recording this session and you'll post it so everybody can look at it again. So where we can find it?
Yeah, so I will, right after we finish today, it takes some time to kind of spool the recording, and I will get the recording kind of processed, and I will have a YouTube link, and I'm going to post the link in this week's forum in your Blackboard. So if you go to this week's forum 1, at the end of the page, if you scroll down, you will get a connect link. If you click on it, it should go to the YouTube version of this recording.
Thank you.
Any other question before we call it a day today? All right, Stacy, I'm really sorry we couldn't make your microphone work. So again, email me with your talk about the case study and then your own topic and discourse. And if you have any question, feel free to email me, and that is true for all of you. If you have any question that come up, or if you have any confusion after you get to the reading or looking into the assignment, or as you're working into the draft, feel free to email me. As you have seen, I try to respond to as soon as I can, and I will try to respond to your emails within a day. Sometimes it won't be instantaneous because of other classes and other schedule, but I would try to respond to you within a day. If you don't hear from me in a day, please send me a reminder. All right, thank you so much for your time. I hope this discussion helped you in understanding about discourse and also clarifying the assignment and helping it through simplification and specification. I look forward to looking at your drafts at the end of this week and reviewing them and giving you feedback. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.